Hi everyone, this is Real World Audio again. And again, let's go to the glow in the dark audio page. And we are at his home page and click home and then you can click amps. And why am I using showing his website so much? First of all, because I love the content of this website and he just has experience and collects amplifiers which I like a lot, and I have experience with similar amplifiers, or let's say exactly I have heard these amps and many others that he reviews, and I would essentially the same experience with them as he describes. However, he has made much more beautiful photographs than I ever had and ever will, and it's much better for you to see some quality photography, and of course hopefully you will visit his website more, and for ideas, for inspiration. So basically he's into low power and free power amplifiers, and right now I'm just mindlessly scrolling through, but I'm looking for something, and I'm looking for that amplifier because you remember last time I have shown to you the 71A vacuum tube. This is the 171UX version from Radiotron, and it's an RCA tube nickel plate, and this is basically from the mid 1920s, almost 100-year-old vacuum tube, so it's way older than I am, basically a century old. And the change from the last video is that I found a nice partner for it, for driver tube, and this is a type 27. It's also a globe tube, and you see it's a mesh plate 27, and they are from the same time, mid to late 20s, and this is just to have them. I really want to have this experience, that to listen to a sound of an amplifier that uses 1 century old devices to amplify the sound. And I think this is a really nice and very interesting experiment, because essentially I want to build something to bring back the sound, the atmosphere from 100 years ago. And people build amplifiers for different purposes. Of course, I have several amplifiers. Each of them actually I built with a very specific, very clear purpose in mind. And then for this amplifier, the purpose will not be to play Deep Purple or Rage Against the Machine, but the purpose will be to play music from 40s, 50s, or even if I have some older recordings like transfers from music that was recorded in 1920s, 30s, I think that will be a truly otherworldly experience to listen to on this amp. And what else is such an amplifier capable of? I haven't built mine yet, so it's basically the cat's in the bag. But here the cat was let out of the bag, and we have an experience here that is shared with us with an amplifier that uses this vacuum tube. And I'm just going to skim through his description. Basically, it represents the outer fringes of single-ended amplification at 0.75 watts output power. And the only other output power tube that has solo output would be the 1626, which is in the famous Darling circuit. I'm going to have a look at the Darling circuit as well. and it will be a very thorough look as well. So this exact amplifier is like an ugly duckling, not because of the vacuum tube, but it was built in a very rugged chassis. Of course, you can build it in a much nicer chassis, so that's not a problem. But he said that it was one of the best sounding within its limitation, and overall one of my top 3 favorite amplifiers so far. And that's a really high praise when we go back and look at the amplifiers that he's showcasing here. There are some maybe that all of us would know. There are like 300B amps, like a bunch of 300B amps. Western Electric 91A 300B amp, which is like a really famous circuit. Maybe here we have like over a half a dozen 300B amps. Look, all kinds of very nice amps. Let's scroll to the top. We have here Oliver Says amps, which are really deluxe over the top amps. Conrad Johnson amplifier, Macintosh, and when you look, there's the Yamamoto as well, and looking at all of this amazing competition, he says, compared to those amps, this is in one of the top 3 amps he had and heard so far. So he's saying that when he had it, it was running more than half time in my rig. The bass is not going to rock the neighbors here, even on super efficient speakers, but the tone and warmth is superb and much like its bigger brother, the 45. And now I pause here because the 45, that's kind of the holy grail of vacuum tubes. And if you have a well-built 45 amp, I can really say that you are set for life. Set, like single-ended triode, right? Double meaning there. But really, all my friends who have 45 amps, it's their main amp for life, and they might have additional amplifiers, and sometimes they listen to that as well, but about 95% of the time it's the 45 they are listening to. And let's say so here also he mentions that during daytime there's too much ambient noise and it's a little difficult to appreciate this amplifier, but for nighttime listening, when you just want some like a contemplative listening, when you want to truly connect to the music, to get to the heart and soul of the music, and just want peace, quiet, and to recharge, then there is no experience like these little tubes. And then he also talks about that the prices of these tubes is much less than a 45 or 2A3 or even like a 300B. However, I would say that the prices are steadily hiking up even on these tubes, and actually if you are building one of these, it's still going to be far cheaper than a 300B amp, but it still will cost you quite a bit more than a Darling amplifier. And let's go back up. What is a Darling amplifier? So here, where did I see the Darling amp? He has here somewhere. No, it will be higher up. Oh, was it there? Was it there? No. It's going to take a little while. Oh, right here. Parallel single-ended 1626, which is called as a double Darling, because when you go, let's see, so this is the Darling amp, and it uses the 1626 vacuum tube as its power tube. So basically, this tube, the 71A, that's the direct heated triode, and the Darling tube, the 1626, is an indirect heated triode. And so that's the main difference between the two, is that here the cathode and the filament are the same, and here the cathode and the filament are separate. Otherwise, they have the exact same power output. But there is also one additional difference between these two tubes that makes the Darling amp much more versatile than the 71A. So if you are going to build an amplifier of this, then it's going to be a very quiet, very low power amp. And the Darling amp, even though the power tube has the same watt output, is going to be a much louder, much more powerful sounding amplifier than the 71A. And how come? There seems to be a conundrum here. Is it? Let's just experiment with this. So let's go. This is a very nice website, NJ7P, and I use this to look up tubes, and here we have looked up the 1626 power triode. And eventually here it doesn't give us that much description, only that the plate voltage, it can handle up to 250 volts and 5 watts plate dissipation. Also it has a 12 volt heater, which is very easy to use, so no fuss. You can get a 12 volt filament transformer very easily to power these triodes. And here you show it's an indirect heated triode, so let's enlarge that. So you see there's the filament, it's separate from the cathode, that's how it's shown. And it means that you do not have to fuss around with the heater to make the amplifier quiet. You can make the Darling amplifier quiet very, very easily. So I can tell you that this is one of those power tubes which is the quietest I ever heard. And how quiet it is, I'm going to tell you when I talk about my experience when I built my Darling amplifier. It's beyond quiet. I have heard other amplifiers which are running on DC filaments, which makes them quieter than running them on AC. But the Darling amp run on pure AC filaments has been the quietest amp I ever experienced. So that's why I can extremely highly recommend it as a starter project, because it's very easy to build it extremely hum-free. And now here comes the main thing. So why this tube has a much bigger sound than the 71A, and the reason for that is tube gain. So the 1626 has a mu of 5, so it means that if it receives 1 volt input, it will have 5 volt output. Now let's look up the 71A. What is the mu of 71A? So as you look at it, the 71A, the gain of that here, amplification factor 3. So it means that if you give it 1 volt signal, it will amplify it 3 times. And now, if you have been watching this video, now you will get a piece of information that will be vital of your audio knowledge, is that if you can tell how dynamic an output tube is based on the amplification factor of that vacuum tube. The higher the amplification factor, the more lively, the more dynamic, the louder that vacuum tube will sound. So essentially, that's why the Darling amps seem to have so much more reserve in them, and they can go so loud and so dynamic because their amplification factor is 5. And let's look up the vacuum tube 45. So what's the mu of 45? What's the amplification factor? Here you go, 3.5. Just barely more than the 71A and less than the 1626. So we have the potential that the Darling tube, the 1626, is a more dynamic tube than the 45. And now let's find out the myth of the tube 46. Because when you look at it, for the tube 45, if you use 250 watts plate voltage, you can get 1.6 watts power out of it. And if you drive it really hard, 275 watts, you can get 2 watts power out of it. Now let's have a look at the 46. It's the tetrode, basically a double grid version of the 45, so it has an extra grid there. And if you triode strap it, you can use it as a triode. But in that case, let's have a look at it. You have 1.25 watts output. So it's almost a little bit more than half of what you can get out of a 45. But everyone who has built both 45 and 46, everyone swears that the 46 is more dynamic and punchier than a 45, even though it's almost half power. So how can this be? Look here, amplification factor for the 46 is 5.6. Let's just go back to the 45. So for the 45, amplification factor was 3.5. So that's why the 46 sounds so dynamic, more dynamic than the 46, because it has almost double the amplification factor. So even though you have less wattage, you're still going to get more punch because of that higher amplification. So what can you do with a vacuum tube that has a lowish amplification factor? How can you make your 45 tube punchier? You can do that by driving it with a tube that has a higher amplification factor. So when you have your power tube, it has a certain amplification factor, let's say 3. If you drive it with something that's like a 27, which has an amplification factor of 9, that's going to make for a very low gain chain. So it will not be a dynamic combination. So to get a little bit more life for this system, I will add a third stage in the beginning. I will also add the 01A to add an 8 times extra boost for amplification factor. And why else, I will explain it on a different video. But this will give me a very different sound than what we think about as a modern punchy dynamic lively sound. So if I want modern punchy dynamic lively sound from the 71A, then let's just put a driver tube in front, let's say maybe a 12AX7, which has a gain of 100, and that will really liven up your tube. So the same thing, if you have a 45 amplifier, add the high gain tube to make it punchier. Sadly, the reality of life is the higher the gain your tube is, the more problems it has with linearity. So that's why I chose the 27, because it is an extremely linear tube. So it means that it doesn't color the sound. You'll get as pure representation of what is recorded as possible. So what people did to circumvent this problem, is that, for example, in the case of a Darling amplifier, we are using a 6J4, which has a gain around 45, 50, and it's still pretty linear, and it's an extremely good match for the 1626 power tube, and this is really a phenomenal combination. So it was Jeremy Epstein who found this combination. He was actually the father of this Darling design. I'm going to talk about that in a video. And this is one way to lighten up your tubes even more. So let's go back. What is he saying about the Darling amplifier? And he is saying that on par sound-wise with 45, 46 and Type 10. His little amp has its own flavor of triode and sounds very good. So basically, if you build a Darling amp, you will get an amplifier that's in the league of a 45 or a 46. And I will share my experience with that. And so, for example, if you look at the 45 amplifier where we have the Yamamoto, that's the most famous example. Or maybe I'm sorry, I'm just doing a lot of scrolling here. Here, the Yamamoto amps. So this amplifier, I would say this is within the, I would say it's definitively one of the top 3 commercial amplifiers in the world that you can buy. And if you build a Darling amp, you are getting a sound that is similar to this amplifier. But I have to add it to you that if you build a project that you make your Darling amp as a $500 project, it's not going to sound like the Yamamoto. It's going to sound like 60% of the Yamamoto. It will be pretty good, but when you do an A/B comparison with the Yamamoto will be like better in every aspect than your Darling amp. And that's what happened to us. So when we built our Darling amps, we had Charlie's Yamamoto with the 45 tube, and when we compared the Darlings against the Yamamoto, and I would say we had 4 Darling amps that we built, and most of our Darling amps, like mine, Tamás's and Charlie's, they were about 60% or 65% of the Yamamoto sound. Kyle's Darling was about 80% of the Yamamoto sound, so depending on the application it can get better and better. But I have to add that all of our Darlings used the cheapest possible output transformer, and the output transformer is really a key to how good your amplifier can sound, what the detail level, what the refinement, what the bass, what the dynamics, what everything is, and that we could get 80% of the way towards the Yamamoto using such pitifully cheap parts is beyond a miracle. So if you made it so far, thank you for joining in. Please like and subscribe, and let's continue reviewing the Darling amp, the 1626. Bye bye. Thank you.